Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Pivit Poker. Have a really great guest for you guys today. Got Zach Elwood on. He's the author of Reading Poker Tells. He's done a lot of deep dives into the psychology behind poker, tells, giveaways, and things like that. So really excited to have you on, Zach.
I'm doing good. How are you, Matt? Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, doing good. So I guess before we dive a little deeper, there are a lot of things that you sent over prior to our show that I really would like to dive into. But before that, I know you've been playing poker for over 10 years, professional poker, and then you kind of dove into the psychology aspect of it. Just to give our viewers a little bit of background, what dove you into this realm of poker? How'd you get into it?
Yeah, and real quick, I'll say, I've been playing. I'm pretty old school, so I played for a living. It's been a long time since I played for a living. So that was back in like 2003 to 2007, and then just on the side as part-time since then. And then occasionally, I'm pretty out of the scene these days. I haven't played much in the past few years. Just to clarify, in case people are like,
Cool.
who the heck is this guy? I've always been interested in psychology. That was one of the reasons I found poker such a fascinating game back in, high school and college. Like in college, I was setting up games and taking money from my friends and people at school and stuff. And I would take notes. This was back in like 2000. I'd take notes on, different behavioral patterns they had. And I was reading books on, everything I could find about psychology and behavior and how it related to poker. And I've always just been a armchair kind of amateur psychologist kind of guy. But then, flash forward to, when I was playing for a living, 2003, 2007, that was when the poker boom hit. And that was how I got into it. Was everybody was playing poker at the casinos and there was a lot of loose money. And I was like, oh, this is actually feasible to, there's a lot of money flowing around. But I was always thinking, when I was playing for a living and then when I was talking to other people that were playing a lot of poker, it was always surprising to me that there hadn't been a better book out there, in my opinion, and in many people's opinion, since Mike Caro's book, the classic book on tells, which was in Rounders and everybody knows about. It was just kind of surprising to me because I and other people had noticed things that were very useful, but that hardly anybody talked about. And Caro's book felt pretty outdated and kind of simplistic. But I was always like, oh, some famous poker player, really experienced poker player is going to write a book about this stuff, with the poker boom going on. But then, years later, 2012, I started working on it in 2010. And I still hadn't seen a good book come out. I'd seen a lot of pretty bad books, honestly. So I was like, well, I guess I'll just write it, if nobody's going to do it. It's not that I think I'm a genius. It's more like, I just think that me and other people know things that just nobody's bothered to write down. And I think I have a pretty good framework for thinking about it. So that was what led to me writing the books. And I didn't know how well they'd be received. And, I was glad to learn that people really liked them. I got a lot of good reviews and got translated eventually into 8 languages total, or maybe 9, can't remember. But just to say, it wasn't like I thought I was some sort of poker tells genius. It was more like, why isn't there a better book out there on this stuff, basically?
Definitely. That's really interesting and really cool that you did that. And so kind of diving into the book and things of that nature, one thing that you talk about is kind of the verbal poker tells, which I don't think a lot of people understand as much, because when you think of poker tells, you think of someone flinching, you think of someone moving their lips or, their little gestures, but verbal poker tells is really interesting. Can you give a little breakdown of that?
So when I wrote the first book, Reading Poker Tells, I was like, I still think there's more to say, but the main area there's a lot more to say about, was the verbal aspect, because nobody had really delved into that stuff in the way they had for body language related things. And what inspired me, people might find it interesting, what inspired me was a book by Mark McClish, who had written a book, I Know You Are Lying, which was about statement analysis and like just real life interrogations, interviews, speeches kind of thing. And that really inspired me because some of the stuff in there mapped over to poker, I thought. And I was like, you can write a interesting book trying to talk about all the patterns you can find in common things people say. And that kind of led me down a rabbit hole. I actually worked on that because I had such success with the first book. I actually had a pretty decent encouragement financially to work on another book. So I spent 8 months like transcribing, watching, literally hundreds of hours of footage and transcribing it into a spreadsheet and like logging common things I heard people say and like seeing how it showed up with different hand strengths. And then when I would play, I would take notes too. So just to say, it was a much lengthier process than I thought, but it yielded some really good learnings. Like I actually I went from thinking I knew most of what I was going to say to like learning a whole bunch about new
Yeah.
things that I didn't even know. And I actually think that was my, I think that's what's going to stand the test of time for the work I've done when people are going to be like, oh, there was a lot of good, when it comes to poker tells, I think that was my main contribution was in these verbal areas.
Mhm.
But yeah, I can talk about like some of the interesting things I found if you want me to.
Yeah, like Bill. So I'm just a little curious as to when you yeah. I mean, maybe on both sides, maybe verbal and physically. Just for our viewers out there, what are the keys to picking those things up? I guess.
Yeah, when it comes to, I'll give you a couple. I'll start with a good verbal one. So the thing that really came together for me, which seemed obvious in hindsight, that's the thing about some of these things. Afterwards, it's like seems kind of obvious, but it's
Right.
about starting to think about things in a different way and putting them in different categories.
Yep.
So the thing that really came together for me was when it comes to statements made by people making large bets. Let's say somebody, making a big bet on the river or something. When
Yep.
it comes to, statements that those players make when there's a statement about hand strength implying that they have a certain hand strength or another player has this hand strength, there's a lot of clues you can get. And a big category is whether someone is implying that their own hand is weak or not. So if they're
Right.
implying their own hand is weak, I call that a weak hand statement. And the pattern that really stands out is any kind of implication that a bettor's hand is weak, their own hand is weak, will tend to really equate to strength and relaxation for the basic reason of a bluffer, somebody making a big bluff basically doesn't want to imply weakness about their hands, not even in a joking way, right? Because they're really afraid how their opponent might interpret that. Like you don't want to say something even joking implying your
Yeah.
hand is weak, and have your opponent snap call, and then you feel like an idiot, right?
Yeah.
So that's kind of obvious. That's kind of obvious at a superficial level. But then there were all once you keyed into that pattern, there were all sorts of ways that pattern played out in very subtle and indirect ways. So I'll give you an example. A player might not say something about his own hand strength. He might imply something about his opponent's hand strength, where he might say, let's say he bets the river and he says, "Oh, I knew you didn't have much," when his opponent didn't call immediately, right? So
Yep.
that by implying he didn't think his opponent had much, that it also implies that he didn't need much to bet, right? So it's
Interesting. Yeah.
indirectly weakening his own hand strength, which very much makes it likely he's strong and is relaxed, and very much makes it super unlikely he's bluffing, basically, when you look at the way all these statements play out. So just to say there were these various, once you key into that category and you start looking for the ways that these kind of like indirect hand strength statements show up, it's super useful because like it's just really unlikely that a player, it does happen. Don't get me wrong. All tells are, about statistics and such, but it's really strong. It's really unlikely a bluffer will want to imply weakness about his hand. And yeah, so that's just one example. I can keep going
Right.
with other stuff if you want.
Yeah, well, I'd be curious. So now we've learned a little bit about the verbal. Going back to your initial studies with just kind of the physical pickups, where could a player kind of start there when they're at a table and they're kind of assessing their surroundings? Are there certain things they can pick up, or something they can take home that's like, okay, I can pick this up about someone?
Yeah, I think I mean one of the most useful categories for body language type stuff is how people move their eyes. I would say like that's eye direction, like whether someone is looking at you or not after they bet. And I'm going to talk here about specifically like what I call big bet behavior, which is behavior associated with somebody making a big bet, which is like
Right.
usually the most important class of category of tells. There's often a myth, a legend, and it comes from Mike Caro's book that bluffers like to stare at you, and that if somebody's staring at you after they bet, they're trying to act in a defensive or aggressive way to imply strength. But the thing I found, and I think most people who are experienced players would agree with me, is actually the reverse of that, where often somebody staring at you after betting is because they're so relaxed, and it's just something that they're more prone to do when they got you where they want you, or they're relaxed. Uh, and that's, not many people, especially more amateur players, feel very comfortable staring at you when they're
Yeah.
bluffing, right?
Right.
Uh, but that's one pattern. But the really important caveat there is like it can go both ways, or it can be quite balanced. Like a lot of players just stare at the same place. But the important thing is just trying to pay attention. Like when somebody makes a big bet, try to study them, see what they're doing with their eyes. Are they looking at their opponent? Are they not? But the other even more important thing than the eye direction is kind of the quality of how their eyes move around. So this is something that's, sometimes the most important tells are things that are lesser known, right? Like the verbal stuff, it's lesser known, so it can be quite reliable. In the same way, the eye, how people move their eyes can be really powerful. So let's say, somebody makes a big bet and they have really loose dynamic eye movements, like they're looking at their opponent, they're looking at the table, they're looking somewhere else, they're looking down at their chips. Like that's correlated to being very relaxed, and what makes a strong hand more likely versus somebody whose eyes are just kind of like locked in one place and staring at the middle of the table, or whatever they're doing with their eyes. So the looseness, just like in general with somebody making loose movements, can be a clue to somebody being relaxed. And that's like a much more powerful tell than even like where they're looking with their eyes.
Yeah. And so going off of that, do you think, as far as the psychology behind it goes, it matters somewhat knowing the opponent? Because I know me, for example, when I'm playing poker and say I get a really good hand, I almost get nervous and like get excited from that. But some other people, they are bluffing and they'll get that nervousness. Some people, different people get nervous for different things. So where does that, in your opinion, come into play with knowing your opponent or doing research on your opponent? What do you think kind of goes in there?
Yeah, for sure. Player-specific information is important. I think it breaks down into a few different classes. It's like there's some tells, in my books and my work, I try to distinguish between things that are more likely to be generally useful for like general population, and there's some things that are just really highly reliable for a general population. Like, for example, the weak hand statement thing I talked about. It's like I would act on that like sight unseen. I just feel really comfortable with certain patterns. I'm just playing the numbers, obviously, but I feel comfortable relying on some of those tells. Same with some of the nonverbal kind of things too. Like, to take an extreme example, like somebody making a bet and then like standing up or something, or doing something really unusual is going to be highly correlated to strength, in a general population. But then to your point, it's like, the more you are playing with regular players, the more you have a chance to observe them. That gives you a chance to act on the more subtle things, right? Because there's lots of, I'd say even most of the stuff is more subtle, especially if you're playing against decent competition. Because everybody's trying to be stoic, and most people are aware of the common ways information leaks. So the more opportunity you have to play with players, that's what when I was playing with regular players a lot, I would keep tabs like for each player and be like, oh, I saw them do this. And then I could kind of look back at some of the common things. Obviously, you don't want to overwhelm yourself because that can be overwhelming, but like things like what they do with their eyes, like bet timing kind of things. Bet timing is another really big one. Like, how keeping track of how common it is from them to bet immediately or take a strangely long time, those kinds of things. But to your point, the more regular players you're playing with, I would say it gets, you don't want to overwhelm yourself, because I think if you're only playing like one session, it can be kind of overkill to try to keep track of, patterns during a single session, which is kind of like, in my mind, it's more like trying to take advantage of some of the more common patterns, the ones that you feel more comfortable relying on. But that's kind of my overview of it.
Yeah, definitely. And so going between, verbal cues and physical cues, have you seen kind of statistically, what's more reliable, quote unquote? Like, are physical cues more reliable and seem to work more? Verbal cues are about the same, or have you seen anything between the two?
Yeah. The interesting thing is, I think it's because the verbal stuff is much less known. I think it's a lot more reliable. So I think if say if my verbal poker tells book became like, was read by every poker player, basically, I think you'd start seeing more that stuff being a lot less reliable.
Right.
But for some specific verbal stuff, it's like really highly reliable, strangely reliable in a way you're like, why is it so reliable? You'd think more people would be on top of this. But that said, some of the verbal stuff's less reliable, but I do think for the things that I use in my game, especially because I've played more cash game. I've hardly played any tournaments. I've always was a cash game player, and people are just much more verbally loose in cash games
Yeah.
than they are in tournaments. Like tournaments, even the amateur players have watched TV. They know to be stoic in tournaments, right?
Yeah.
Versus cash games, people are just like kind of like rambling on in various spots,
Yep.
So a lot depends on the game you'll play too, because you can get a lot of verbal stuff from a cash game, and you can even make the environment more friendly by talking more and inducing more people to talk and get more tells that way, which you can't really sometimes do that in tournaments. But yeah, in general, I think the interesting thing to me has been how reliable some of the verbal stuff has been.
Love it. Love it. That's really interesting. And so, just kind of switching gears here, going into, the work outside of just the writing you've done with all of this. You've consulted for 2 World Series of Poker placed players, Max Steinberg and then Amir Leovot, could be butchering that name. Excuse
the Hobbit,
me if
I think he says. Yeah.
Okay, great. But that's really interesting there. And so I'd be really curious as to like, one, just how do you train someone in that? And then 2, what is that poker consulting life like? Just seems like a really interesting kind of way, consult, they consult in all types of businesses, but within poker, just really interested to see, how that works.
Yeah, it's definitely not something I've done a lot of. And the main reason for that, I've done a few other gigs like that that involved people sending me, like when they were on, live stream. So they had live stream footage from tournaments or cash games, and they would send me a good amount of hours to look at. But the 2 World Series of Poker main event players, that was mainly a function of you might remember there used to be that several week or month gap between the playing down to the summer end and then having the final table in November. So the main reason I got those consults was because those players had a long gap to prepare, and they were trying to maximize their preparation and research. So because that doesn't happen anymore, there's no longer like a gap that they have that you would allow for more extensive research. Because what I did for them was basically like I sought out all the footage I could find that was available for each of their players. Sometimes there wasn't any, but for a few there was like a significant amount of footage. I studied the footage looking for possible patterns that we could look at when the final table happened. I studied their own footage to look for leaks they might have. So it was quite time intensive, and that's just not really possible with most tournament setups. It was a lot of fun, and I'm glad I got a chance to do it, but it was, and I'll say, to be honest, it was like, because, knowing that everybody's going to be at the top of their game at the final table, we knew it would be unlikely that you would find like a really meaningful tell. That said, there were a couple of things that were interesting where I felt like, there were things that if it had gone a certain way, there could have been a behavior, a pattern that certain players had that could have played a big role in how things went down. But we knew it was a long shot, but it was also the function of like millions of dollars being on the line and wanting to cover all your bases if you could, basically.
Yeah, that's interesting. And so when you get to that level and you're at that final table, and this is, the best of the best at poker, what are some of the tells that even the best of the best, like, quote unquote, slip up on?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say there's certain things. I mean, you can find some significant tells that patterns that are surprising from people at the highest levels. And I'll give you an example. From I think it was the 2011 World Series of Poker, where I was watching it. I was watching the live stream of the final table. It was actually down to heads up. It was Pius Hines and Martin Stashko, and the tell that Hines had, and Hines was mostly an online player, which was interesting to me, because I was like, well, if I'm going to find anything from these guys, it'll be from the people who mostly played online and weren't used to playing live. And he had a pattern where it was related to, like, he was somebody who was more likely to stare at his opponent heads up. They were heads up, so he was often staring at Martin. That was kind of his MO when he had weak or medium strength hands. But then I noticed one hand where he suddenly was like looking down a lot pre-flop and looking down the flop when he bet. I was like, oh, he's probably got aces or kings or something, this was a deviation that was really strange for him. And I was like, sure enough, he had aces. And then that made me clue into that. And I went back and watched later. And just to say that there was this dramatic, difference between, in most spots where when he looked down, it was much more likely for him to have a strong hand because it's kind of the reversal of what I talked about earlier, talking about that player specific tendencies. Like his MO was to stare at people as his MO, and then he would deviate and it kind of had an instinct to act a little weaker and more vulnerable. And that played out, when he had a strong hand, that played out as him looking down and looking a little bit more bashful and stuff. But everybody, that's getting into the player specific stuff. But yeah, that's one is the eye direction, but also just like there's some things about like how you reach for your chips and handle your chips. So for example, and these are kind of lesser known things too. And I see a lot of this is kind of like one of the bigger classes of meaningful tells is reaching for, let's say a player's deciding to bet on the river, a big bet. And, they fairly quickly reach for their chips, and then they're like making, movements to stack them up. And there's like a long pause between the moment when they're going to bet or raise and when they actually put the bet in. And what happens is the more kind of pausing, the more time that is elapsed, or the more movements that are involved with placing the bet or the raise, the more that's associated with strength, because bluffers have more of a tendency to just like make an easy, simple movement, and they want to minimize the amount of time that, somebody's examining and these kinds of things. So in general, these kind of things that, where somebody's like stacking up a lot of chips and taking a long time and like pausing, especially like pauses in there, that makes me think of another thing from that same game with P.S. Hines and Martin Stashko, where Stashko had this really a big pattern where like he was putting together a raise and then just like he pauses in the middle of it for a long time, and you're like, if you were a bluffer, like it's really unlikely for a bluffer to be like, let me pause in the middle of my bet assembly and just, look like I'm not sure whether I want to bet or not. Right. So just to say there's these kinds of things, and they can be quite subtle, like, and the better the player is, like the more consistent they are. Sometimes even those small, subtle things can be like, oh, this guy paused a little bit in his bet placement. I'm just going to err on the side of folding to this guy because I think that's going to make it much more likely he's strong, relaxed, and this kind of thing. Yeah.
Good stuff. Good stuff. Well, that's really interesting, and appreciate you breaking that down, because it's always curious, in any sport, especially poker, when you get to the top, what are those guys doing? Yeah. But last thing real quick, and then we'll get you out of here. Appreciate you giving us time today. You talk a lot about deception detecting versus poker tells. And so I'm a little curious to that is the deception detecting, is that more so the bluffing in your opinion? But just a little curious as to what the difference between those two things are.
Yeah, this is something I actually want to write about or do a specific podcast episode about, because, so I've interviewed people from my psychology behavior focused podcast, people who read people. I've had talks with behavior experts, behavior researchers, and detection researchers. And most people who study these things say there's actually very little, despite what many people think, there's actually no really good nonverbal body language thing that can clue you into deception, right? Despite a lot of misconceptions or perceptions about that.
Interesting.
There's really not good patterns when you look at the research. There might be there might be person-specific patterns, but with these ideas, like I'll give you the extreme myth is like you'll often hear kind of like behavior bullshit kind of people being like, oh, if they look up and to the left, you'll get a clue as to they're recalling something or accessing a different part of the brain. And that's all pretty much bullshit. Like there's no good things like this that you can be like, oh, they're lying. I think they're more likely because of this behavior in a general population. So, but people are surprised that I believe that, because they're like, well, don't you study, poker tells? Don't you believe poker tells exist? And that's my point, is like poker tells are not related to deception detection. So, to make the analogy, there's no equivalent in poker at all, or most games, for like direct deception, right? So when you bluff, it's not telling a lie, right? It's not the same thing as like I'm telling a lie to someone and someone might be able to deduce that I'm lying. Like bluffing is part of the game. It's not directly equivalent to telling a lie, right? There are some similarities, but it's just to say that most of the tells in poker don't come from tells of like whether someone's deceiving you or not. They come from like, is someone relaxed or not, right? Like, so are they relaxed? Are they anxious? So when you're reading, you might get a tell from somebody if they're more likely bluffing or more likely value betting, but those are usually going to be tells of like, oh, this guy's really relaxed seeming. I know that's a tell of relaxation. So that's not an equivalent of deception, right? So in the same way, somebody might be relaxed or not relaxed early in their hand, and it's not related to bluffing, right? And also, there's also tells of whether somebody's paying attention or not, or how focused they are, right? Like, so
Yeah.
a stereotypical tell of like the flop comes out and somebody looks away quickly from connecting with a set or something on the flop, like that kind of tell, or they look at aces and they quickly put the hand down. Those kinds of tells,
Right.
like those are they are related to deception, right? They're related to like focus or not wanting to draw attention to strength or these kinds of things. So there's other categories of tells in poker and other games. But the thing that's interesting to me is like these things don't relate to deception detection. And I think that's interesting too, because people in the deception detection space don't know much about poker. So they can sometimes be more pessimistic about poker tells than is warranted, because they think that poker tells are about reading deception when it's not. So anyway, I just find that interesting to try to distinguish those two areas.
Nice. That's really, really interesting. And yeah, we'll be on the lookout for more stuff from you that's kind of going off of that. You just said beforehand, you have a great podcast. I know you got a lot going on. Do you want to plug kind of some of the things you're working on? We'll throw this all in the description as well.
Yeah, sure. If people are interested in this stuff, I just have a general psychology and behavior podcast. People who read people, you can learn about it at behavior-podcast.com. And I sometimes talk about poker on there, but I talk about other stuff too. It was just kind of my excuse to delve into things I was interested about. And wanted to say thanks to Wayne too, who's got his he's got his two-hand hold'em. Yeah, that's what's up.
Yep, we did a live last episode. I won $600K on two-hand hold'em.
Nice.
And play money.
Real money.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
That's too bad. He should have hooked you up with the real money.
I know.
He should give you the chance to win real money from him. Now that'd be good promotion for Wayne. Yeah.
Yep. I know it's live in Spokane, Washington at the America's Best Casino. So I know it's live there for real money. So that's if people are around there, they can try it out there.
Yeah. But other than that, I just I do my podcast. I work on some other things, but the podcast is probably the thing most people would be interested in.
Cool. Well, we'll link all that as well as your book in the description here. So again, Zach, you've given us so much. I know our viewers are going to be just ecstatic about the content we got here. A lot of things that people just aren't talking about, like you said, and people don't really know. So really excited. Appreciate you coming on, and we'll be on the lookout for anything new from you, brother.
Thanks, Matt. Good questions.